dear friends. My name is James Jacob Prash from Oriel Ministries, speaking to you this week about, of course, Thanksgiving if you live in the United States, but it is a teaching, a message that I hope people in other countries will also find edifying and interesting. Thanksgiving. You know, there's a biblical Thanksgiving, and there's the Thanksgiving as it is popularly celebrated, particularly in the USA. Let's understand both. Thanksgiving was proclaimed a national holiday in the United States by Abraham Lincoln in the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg, the bloodiest, costliest battle in the history of the United States. 50,000 plus Americans were killed in the Battle of Gettysburg. And it was a decisive turning point in the Civil War. It came on the heels of the Battle of Vicksburg in the west of the theater of the war, west of the Appalachian Mountains, where the Mississippi River was now reopened following the Union victory at Vicksburg by Ulysses Simpson Grant, who Lincoln then appointed General-in-Chief over all Union forces from the north. That was in the west. But on the eastern side of the Appalachians, called the Army of the Potomac, as opposed to the Army of the Cumberland, the Army of the Potomac fought in the eastern theater. And for the second time, the Confederates under Robert E. Lee attempted to invade the north. The first time they attempted that was in the Battle of Antietam. That had the highest casualties in one day of any battle in American history. But Gettysburg was a battle of 3.5 days, and it was the overall costliest battle. After Vicksburg and Gettysburg, it became impossible for the South strategically to win or even have a brokered, negotiated end of the Civil War. The hope of Lee had been he could take the war north of the Mason-Dixon line, north of the Potomac River, and so forth, and make the cost higher and higher for the Union to continue fighting to preserve the Union. Therefore, the North would be politically pressured into negotiating. And there were people in the North who wanted to do that. But Gettysburg changed all that. While it was never possible for the South to win the war against the North, it was possible to force the North into a negotiated settlement. So thought Robert E. Lee and the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. This, however, did not work because of the Battle of Gettysburg, an incredibly bloody battlefield that Abraham Lincoln visited some months later and gave his famous Gettysburg Address. It was against this background that he proclaimed Thanksgiving a national day of Thanksgiving. Most people do not associate Thanksgiving with a national holiday that was proclaimed such because of a military victory. The military victory, however, was marred by many, many things. The Emancipation Proclamation, the legislation passed by Congress at the behest of Abraham Lincoln, did not actually abolish slavery. It simply abolished slavery places where the Union conquered in the South. The abolition of slavery happened after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln with the 16th Amendment. The Emancipation Proclamation was a temporary provision, and it was essentially designed to keep Great Britain, which at that time controlled Canada, out of the war from fighting on the side of the South by making slavery a moral issue. Benjamin Disraeli, a Jewish Christian who was Prime Minister of Great Britain, was opposed to the political pressures to bring Britain into the war on the side of the South. He did not approve of slavery himself, and he resisted the political pressure of interest in Britain in the textile industry that required large amounts of cotton that up to that point had been provided by the American South, and also tobacco industry, tobacco trade, and so forth, with Virginia Tobacco. The war had economic repercussions for the British Empire, at least temporarily, until the British began getting cotton from the Nile Delta. At that time, Egypt became, Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, and it was under British political control and economic control. There were alternative sources to get cotton and circumvent the problems presented by the blockading of southern ports by the Union Navy. Well, this is what took place, and it was against this horrible background that Thanksgiving became a national holiday. It had to do with a military victory that made it impossible for the South to continue as a viable power and forced the North to the negotiating table. The Union would have to be preserved, and slavery would eventually be condemned. This is what it was. It was seen as this at the time it was made by act of Congress at the behest of Abraham Lincoln, a national holiday. Now, most people have never thought of that or even heard of it. They simply would know at most that it was Abraham Lincoln who made it a national holiday. Well, we all know the story, or most people from America know the story of the so-called pilgrims who came from Plymouth, England, and arrived at Plymouth Rock on Cape Cod in Massachusetts and established an English colony. This was not the first British colony. The first was Jamestown that was permanent. Others didn't survive, like Roanoke, and Jamestown hardly survived. Those were in Virginia and North Carolina in the days of Sir Walter Raleigh. The Indian from the local tribe who spoke English had been abducted as a slave from another tribe and taken to England. John Samoson, and he was the interpreter for the pilgrims when they arrived, and of course the local Indians taught the pilgrims how to plant maize and things like this that assured their survival after so many had died of hunger and exposure. It was a very brutal first year from 1620 to 1621. But this peace with the Indians was a military alliance. Before the pilgrims arrived, probably 90% of that tribe, the local tribe who lived there, had been decimated by some kind of a disease. The pilgrims went to the grain storages, virtually in the cemeteries, where the Indians were interred. The corpses were interred to find food to eat. They actually went grave scavenging to find food sustenance in burial grounds. This is how terrible it was. But the Narragansett Indians were the enemy of the local tribe. Long before the white man came to the United States, the Indian tribes were at war with each other, much like tribal Africa. Everyone knows what the white man did to the American Red Indian, to the Native American. Everybody knows what the European did to the black African. But somehow it becomes politically incorrect to tell the whole truth. What the Native American Indians did to each other, what the black Africans did to each other, etc., etc. What went on in China in the period of the Warring States, and so forth, long before the Boxer Rebellion. The evils and injustices of colonialism are what everyone frames in this age of people talking about being woke and intersectionality and endemic racism. Nobody wants to tell the entire historical truth about how we got to where we are from the inception. It was a military alliance. The so-called pilgrims had firearms, and they had metallic tools of tremendous value to the Indians. They were good trading partners. So it went. This is the background of the story. Myth 1. They were called the Pilgrims. The people who came on the Mayflower were called the Pilgrims. And they came from England. Nothing could be further from the truth. They escaped religious persecution and they sought religious freedom in Massachusetts, in colonial America, and that's why they fled on the Mayflower. Nothing could be further from the truth. To begin with, the Pilgrims did not call themselves pilgrims. They called themselves and were called by others separatists. Separatists. They were a nonconformist Puritan sect. There were two kinds of Puritans who believed the Protestant Reformation did not go far enough. There were those who were non-separatists who remained in the Church of England and sought to reform it from within. Among these would be the author William Gurnall, A Christian in Complete Armor. But then you had those who believed the Church of England was so defiled, it was irredeemable and you had to break away from it. These were the separatists. Now notice, this is the same kind of issue happening in England today. There are those who believed they could change the Church of England from within with charismatic renewal, and they failed miserably. And there are those who have just left the Church of England and sought fellowship elsewhere because they believe it has gone too far. But this is not a new problem, and it's not the first time this kind of a problem has emerged in ecclesiastical or British history. You cannot understand the present unless you understand the past, and you cannot understand the future unless you understand the past. The first thing we need, beyond prayer and understanding prophecy, is a correct interpretation and knowledge of history. We've said this many times. So the kinds of issues that were happening in Britain and America at the time we attribute to the Mayflower and the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving are very closely related to what we see now. In the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg, there were horrific riots in New York City particularly, and in other cities, but particularly New York, particularly Manhattan. Working class white people, many of them Irish immigrants from the Democratic Party, attacked black people, and black people fought back in New York City over the draft riots. The Irish did not like being drafted to fight for blacks, and they were afraid with the Emancipation Proclamation that black people would come up from the South and take their jobs. These were people who fled the potato famine in Ireland, and they were hoping for a new and better life in the United States. In fact, the treatment of the Irish in the United States was in many respects worse than the treatment of blacks in the United States and the South. Again, as we've said before, a black person had a capital value as a slave. If a slave died, someone was out of pocket. If an Irishman died, so what? Who cared? Hence, the Irish were used for the most dangerous jobs, such as coal mining, as was done with the blasting for the railroads in the West by the Chinese. Nobody cared about a Chinaman or an Irishman. A black had a cash value. So there was a crisis within the Democratic Party. And the Irish-dominated political machines that began to emerge, Tammany Hall in New York, was in this political crisis between working class whites and black people. Sound familiar? Again, what we see now is not historically new, and it is not historically confined to the present. As we've been saying, nation will rise against nation, ethnon against ethnon. Ethnic racial tensions increase in the last days, Jesus warned us. But let's go back now to the separatists who people call Puritans. John Bradford, the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, did make some reference to the separatists as pilgrims, but they were not called that. They called themselves, and everyone else called them, separatists. They were Puritans who believed we had to see a situation where there was a wholesale departure from the Church of England because it was spiritually, morally, ecclesiologically irredeemable. They were persecuted by King James. King James convened a forum of scholars, both Puritan and Anglican, to translate the King James Bible in 1611. This is what he did. The reason he did this with the non-separatist Puritans and the Anglicans was he wanted a different Bible that would support his position politically and ecclesiologically against the Bible of the separatists, which was the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible was the first Bible that was printed in a large scale in the English language. You had copies of Tyndale's Bible or Wycliffe's Bible, but now with the printing presses and so forth, it was massively produced. The Geneva Bible was the Bible of the Mayflower Pilgrims predominantly. It was certainly the Bible of John Bunyan, the Baptist author of the Pilgrim's Progress. It was the Bible of John Knox, the founder of Presbyterianism. It was the Bible of Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans when they eventually came to political power in England. It was not, however, the Bible of King James. King James wanted a separate translation. There was a conflict between the separatists and King James. He persecuted them brutally. Their leaders were John Robinson and William Brewster. They were largely from the north of England, the northeast of England, Yorkshire, Doncaster, and Lincolnshire. Around the cities of Worksop, Doncaster, and places of that nature is where they were concentrated. Perhaps not coincidentally, it's the same area where John and Charles Wesley would be born in Epworth, near Doncaster, later on. But that's where they came from. And they fled persecution. Horrible things happened to them. Horrible things happened to them near Hull. Women and children were burned or drowned on a barge, hundreds of them, by King James. King James was a brutal, brutal tyrant. The man responsible for the Authorized Bible was a horrific persecutor of other Christians. And I mean people who claim to be born again, nonconformists. I don't know if he was a Christian himself. Most historians, like William Churchill, believed he was depraved, and probably the majority believe him to have been a homosexual. Be that as it may, in 1608, the Puritan separatists fled religious persecution. But they did not get on the Mayflower in Plymouth, England, and come to Massachusetts. They went to Holland. And they stayed in Holland for a number of years. They stayed there, but realized they had a problem. They were acculturating into the Dutch language and culture. Their children were losing their English identities. Holland was a place of theological debate always between the Arminians. Jacob Arminius was from Holland, and the Dutch Calvinists. And the Puritans were sandwiched into this situation in Holland that had been going on for some time. It was also Holland where a libertarianism and a freedom of thought and expression took place that would influence both American democracy and parliamentary democracy in England. They went to Holland. Holland had its Renaissance. The Protestant Renaissance took place in Holland. The cities of Amsterdam and Delft and so forth were to the Protestant Renaissance what Venice and Florence were to the Roman Catholic Renaissance, for want of a better term. Rembrandt and the painters and these things came from Holland. And so the separatists fled religious persecution from King James. They fled King James into Holland. But then something happened. Their identity was threatened after one generation. Their children became more apt in speaking Dutch than English. Their leaders, again, had been John Robinson and William Brewster. but they resolved to get ships, one called the Speedwell that never made it, the other the Mayflower, and came to an arrangement with the British Crown that they would have religious freedom and prospects of making a society and culture of their own if they immigrated to the North American colonies. Hence, traveling via England, via the port of Plymouth, they boarded the Mayflower and headed to Massachusetts. When they fled religious persecution, it was not to Massachusetts. It was not from England. It was from England to Holland, not from England to Massachusetts. They already had escaped England long before that. This was the next generation almost, heading across the Atlantic with leaders like John Bradford and Miles Standish and so forth. And they come on the Mayflower to Massachusetts and arrive at Cape Cod, where the local Indian tribe had been decimated, perhaps 90% exterminated, by a disease, a plague of some description still not medically understood. They become trading partners, and because of the conflict between the Wanamagansett Indians who lived in the Cape Cod area and the Narragansett Indians, who were their rivals, an alliance was made that was in the interest of both parties. That is how it came about. Now, the Puritans, again, they had their Geneva Bible. They were not King James people. King James had been their persecutor. The Geneva Bible came, of course, from Geneva after the Marian exile, when Queen Mary I, the half-sister of Elizabeth, tried to re-Catholicize England in the aftermath of the Reformation. She martyred Ridley, Latimer, Hooper, Cranmer, people like this, the Oxford martyrs and so forth, all took place under Mary's reign of terror. She's colloquially known in England to this day as Bloody Mary. Those who fled to Calvin's Geneva, where they were influenced by Calvin's version of Protestantism, and there they developed their own English Bible called the Geneva Bible when they came back to England. That was, again, mass-produced. This was not the Bible of King James. This was the Bible of John Bunyan, the Bible of John Knox, the Bible of Cromwell, and the Bible primarily of the so-called pilgrims, the separatists. So you had two kinds of Puritans, the ones who stayed and the ones who separated. They come to Massachusetts into the situation I described. The Puritans actually did have an annual Thanksgiving time to the Lord, but it was not a day of feasting. It was a day of fasting and prayer. They were given to fasting and prayer. It was not a festal celebration as such, accompanied by elaborate dining. It was not that. They wouldn't have known anything about cranberries or turnips, and turkey would only have been one of many dishes. It was not like that. It was customary in all of English culture to have an autumn celebration that would have been a meal, but the religious celebration would have been characterized by fasting, not by eating. I would dare say that the separatists, if they were to look at Thanksgiving today, not just the football games and the parade in New York City with the floats, but the excessive eating, they would have seen it as gluttonous debauchery. This goes on. About 10 years later, the mainstream Puritans arrive from England, and things begin to change. Eventually, the Puritans came to power in the 1650s in England under Cromwell, following the English Civil War. And again, there was a non-uniform situation. You had the extreme Calvinistic Puritans following the decapitation of Charles I and so forth, and they found their theology in John Owen, the chaplain to Cromwell. But then you had more moderate ones, championed by people like Richard Baxter and Joseph Aileen, the evangelist. The Puritans were not a uniform sect by any means. And there were other people still within the Church of England identified as Puritans by virtue of their theology, but not by virtue of their denomination. They were non-separatist Puritans. But Cromwell now comes to power. When Cromwell is in power, some things happen that are very ugly historically, that a lot of Calvinistic Christians wish to forget or overlook. The same as they wish to forget and overlook the atrocities perpetrated by Calvin himself, killing over 250 people by burning them alive in the name of Jesus Christ in Geneva. They don't like to talk about what happened when the English Puritan Calvinists and the Scottish Presbyterian Calvinists had a war, and the Puritans massacred their fellow Calvinists in a very, very ugly series of battles between England and Scotland. Notice that Protestantism, that Calvinism could not erase the divisions that had always existed between the Anglo-Saxons and the Celts. In Ireland, there was a history already of tension with England, going back to Henry VIII and to Elizabeth I. But some things happened when Cromwell invaded Ireland at a place called Drogheda, north of Dublin. And this introduced the plantation period, where the wealth of the righteous, the wealth of the wicked is stored up for the righteous. And so the Calvinists, the Puritans said, well, we're the righteous, we're the believers, you're Roman Catholic, you're the pagans, we're going to take your land, your houses, and your farms, and you're going to be our serfs. Because the wealth of the wicked is stored up for the righteous. Calvinism had no problem with the enslavement of black Africans. This actually also commenced in Holland. They had no problem with it. We're the elect. The Africans are not. The Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa, through the apartheid era, came from this, but it of course stretched across the Atlantic with the Southern Baptists and the Southern Methodists, the Calvinistic denominations of the American South, who were pro-slavery, as opposed to the abolitionist ones of the North that were anti-slavery. Even a benevolent slave owner, George Whitefield, approved of slavery. He owned black slaves. This was a great preacher in many respects. John Wesley, of course, and later John Newton, they vehemently opposed the institution of slavery. It became a theological debate, and there were theological demarcations in the American Civil War because of it. You see much the same today. The liberation theology people, the liberal Protestantism going one side with people like Tim Keller and Rick Warren and the woke movement, while you have conservative evangelicals going the other. Again, we must learn the lessons of history and of church history to understand our present situation and to gauge our future destiny. And Thanksgiving is a perfect time to do it. So we look now. The Puritans now come from England, the mainstream Puritans, 10 years later. And eventually, Cromwell comes to power. There were people in England who influenced the Puritans in Massachusetts. In England under Cromwell, it was not only what went wrong with the wars in Ireland and Scotland, but it was what happened with the witch hunter general. The witch hunter general. It showed that Calvinistic Protestants were just as capable of conducting ugly, murderous inquisitions as the Roman Catholic Church and the Dominicans had done before the Reformation. They did the same thing. People were, of course, criminally convicted, most of them women, not all of them, many of them defenseless old women, on the basis of spectral evidence. If you want to talk about hyper-charismatic lunacy, oh, the Lord showed me Mary Jones was a witch. Yes, I had a dream and the Lord showed me Mary Jones was a witch. We have to find out if she's a witch. The testimony of two is correct. They would, of course, cut a hole in the ice in a lake, tie it to the end of a pole. If she drowned, oh, she was innocent. She's with the Lord. If she didn't drown, you see, she used her witchcraft powers. Hang her, burn her. We just explained these things before. This is what the Puritans did. This came from Calvinism. This is what went on in Cromwell's England. With John Owen, the great Puritan Reformed theologian, as his spiritual counselor. Even genocidally massacring other Calvinists in the wars with Scotland. Well, eventually this surfaces in Salem, Massachusetts, north of Boston. Salem was not so much a town. There is a town, Salem, famous for the House of the Seven Gables and so forth, and Nathaniel Hawthorne's books and so forth, but it was a general area all around what is today Salem. Danvers is the place near Salem where the actual witch hangings had their epicenter and where most of it initially happened, though it spread out as far away as Boston. This was a horrible, horrible blotch in colonial history in the United States. But it came from England and was brought to America by the Calvinists, by the Puritans. There were some who became disgusted at the way Puritanism had evolved in America, and they left Massachusetts wanting to have a different kind of Protestant, authentically democratic, new life, new world. One was Roger Williams, who came and established the state of Rhode Island. Today, it's a bastion of liberal theology. It has nothing to do with its evangelical origins of Roger Williams, but Roger Williams established it. Williams actually knew Cromwell. Another was Joseph Hooker, who established Connecticut. The first constitution in the United States was not the U.S. Constitution, nor was it the Articles of Confederation. The first Constitution in the United States were the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. These things, with Joseph Hooker and with Roger Williams, they broke away from mainstream Puritanism and tried to get away from what the Puritans did in Massachusetts. This is the history. Thanksgiving to the separatists was a time of prayer and even fasting. It was not a time of feasting. There were feasts, but they were not of a ritual orientation. The two converged, became conflated at about 1830. The religious aspect and the festal dining aspect became conflated in about 1830. But not until the American Civil War did it become a national holiday in the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg, at a very troubled time despite the military victories. Gordon Meade was the Union general who defeated Lee at Gettysburg, and Lee's battered army escaped across the Potomac to the south. Lincoln was angry that Meade would not attack the Confederates as they retreated back into Virginia. He believed, and many military historians to this day believe, that would have ended the war, even though it would have taken another 20,000 or 25,000 fatalities, and perhaps double that in casualties. It would have ended the war and saved more life in the long term. There was a crisis. Should Lincoln fire this general who just won this victory over Lee, which was almost unprecedented? Lee was actually defeated with Stonewall Jackson at Antietam as well, but that was another situation. Now, Lincoln could not fire this general for insubordination because he was something of a national hero. Well, the riots in New York begin a few days later. Instead of the Union attacking the retreating Confederates, military regiments and militia regiments of the state of New York are diverted back to Manhattan to put the riots down. What today we would call the Insurrection Act, or in Britain, the Riot Act. The local mayors and governors could not put down the rioting. Again, we're talking about organized political corruption and the Democratic Party with Tammany Hall. Now, this phenomena exploded across the Midwest and elsewhere on the East Coast of America. It came to evolve. In Boston, it was eventually the Kennedy machine, a Democratic Party machine, a political machine in Boston, dominated by Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of JFK. In New Jersey, it was Frank Hague. Again, this all went back to the time of the bootlegging and the prohibition and so forth. In the Midwest, it was the Cook County machine. Cook County being the most, to this day probably, corrupt political machine in the country, that is Chicago. That was dominated by the Dailies. You had these major Irish Catholic political machines. But Tammany Hall was the flagship one in New York. You had governors and mayors who wouldn't put down the rioting. They were caught in a political quagmire, so the federal government stepped in. Sound familiar? It's what we're facing today, prospectively. No, Thanksgiving is not what most people think. It has little to do with the historical realities from which it derives. The idea of giving thanks to God, well, that's a good idea. But the way Thanksgiving came to evolve, the separatists, the so-called pilgrims, would have seen it again as a gluttonous fiasco. When they celebrated thanking God for his provision, they fasted. They didn't overindulgently eat. This is the reality. They were not even called pilgrims. They were called separatists. They did not flee religious persecution in England. They fled acculturation in Holland. The fleeing from King James happened earlier, and they fled to Holland, not to Massachusetts. Voltaire was not a Christian, he was anti-Christian. And on his deathbed, he knew he was going to hell because he said that Christianity would be dead in 100 years, and 100 years later, the very house he said it in France was being used to print Bibles. I do not like Voltaire philosophically, but I liked Voltaire in terms of his ability as a writer. There are many authors like that. Edgar Allan Poe is another one. Certainly Ernest Hemingway. He killed himself, but he was a talented writer. Well, so was Voltaire. Voltaire said, history is the lie everybody agrees on. Well, I suppose he's right. Thanksgiving seems to be something of a lie that everybody agrees on. It is mythologized. It is myth. It is not simply embellished. It is largely fabricated. Most of it has no relationship to what actually historically transpired, going back to the Battle of Gettysburg, going back to the separatists, going back to the origins of Puritan thought and theology. No one really understands the genesis of it except for a handful of Christians and perhaps some secular academics. Most people don't know what it was. I'm not speaking against it. I like the idea of families getting together and praying and saying grace and thanking God for his goodness. When I was a little boy in New York, I went to the Thanksgiving Day parade, and I understand how people like the football games and things like this. But it's not what they teach people on a popular level, even in school. It was not like that. It is all essentially mythologized. It's not real. Well, let's look at the real Thanksgiving. I did a teaching on this subject some years ago in Arizona in the United States. Let's just revisit it briefly. God's idea of Thanksgiving, also celebrated in the autumn time. Look with me, please, to the book of Leviticus, chapter 23. On exactly the 15th day of the 7th month, Tishrei, when you have gathered in the crops of the land, you shall celebrate the feast of the Lord for 7 days, with a rest on the first day and a rest on the 8th day. Now on the first day you shall take for yourselves the foliage of beautiful trees, palm branches and boughs of leafy trees and willows of the brook. You shall rejoice before the Lord for 7 days. You shall thus celebrate it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days in the year. It shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall live in booths for 7 days. All the native born of Israel shall live in booths, so that your generations may know that I had the sons of Israel live in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So Moses declared to the sons of Israel the appointed times of the Lord. This is biblical Thanksgiving. This is when God declared it should be, not for the church, of course, but for Israel. And notice, it was to be something that went on for a week. Today, Thanksgiving is basically a food festival, followed by Black Friday, which launches the Christmas, Hanukkah shopping season. Again, no resemblance to Thanksgiving of God. No resemblance. Well, let's go to the New Testament and see where this is fulfilled, partially fulfilled by Jesus in John chapter 7. After these things, verse 1, Jesus was walking in Galilee, and he was unwilling to walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now, the Jews, of course, meant the Judeans, the religious establishment controlled by the Sanhedrin. Now, the feast of the Jews, the feast of booths, Hag Sukkot, it's called in Hebrew, was near. Therefore, his brothers went to him. Remember, in Leviticus 23, it had to be celebrated by families. It was a family time. Leave here and go into Judea, so that your disciples may see your works, which you are doing. For no one does anything in secret when he himself seeks to be known publicly. If you do these things, those if you do these things, show yourself to the world, for not even his brothers were believing in him. So Jesus said, my time is not yet here, but your time is always opportune. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify against it, that its deeds are evil. Go up to the feast yourselves. I do not go up to this feast, because my time has not yet come. Having said these things to them, he remained in Galilee. But when the brothers had gone up to the feast, then he himself also went up, not publicly, but as it were in secret. So the Judeans, or the Jews who were seeking him at the feast and were saying, where is he? There was much grumbling about the crowds contending about him. Some were saying, he's a good man. Others saying, no, on the contrary, he leads the people astray. Yet no one was speaking openly of him for fear of the Jews, that is, the religious establishment. Now this passage says nobody was speaking of him publicly for fear of the Jews. Understand, again, something we always point out, the Greek word Judeoi. They were all Jews. It was not because of the ethnic Jews, because of the religious establishment. They were all Jewish. The Jews were afraid of the Jews. No, the common people, the Am Haaretz, were afraid of the Sanhedrin, and to a degree of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Well, let's look now further. Again, it was a family time. Families were to celebrate this. Families. This is important. Today in our Western American Thanksgiving, Thanksgiving is a family time. It almost tries to imitate the biblical Thanksgiving, the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Booths, Hag Sukkot. Tries to imitate it. And Jesus says, I'm not going. He's not going with his family. We'd like to invite you to Thanksgiving dinner. No, I'm not coming. My time is not yet. He does show up, but he maintains a very low profile. Now, the reasons for this are explained and developed further in the chapter, with something called the Simcha Bet Shoivah and the pouring out of the living waters and so forth, and the ritual parade and procession, which the contemporary archaeology in the city of David in Jerusalem verifies the New Testament, as well as the accounts of Josephus and of the Mishnah like a glove. It's the very festal stairway, taking the living water, the Maim Hayim, from the pool of Siloam up to the Temple Mount on this stairway. It's fully excavated. You can see exactly what the New Testament explains or portrays, and it's complemented by both Josephus and the Mishnah. Nonetheless, that's a separate story. This is Jesus. He's there, but he's secretly there. People don't see him. Well, Jesus is here, but he's secretly there. People don't see him. They will see him one day at a feast, but most of them won't be invited. The ultimate messianic fulfillment, the ultimate Thanksgiving, is when Christ returns and sets up his kingdom. Yes, it was because of the victory at Gettysburg, following the victory at Vicksburg, that Abraham Lincoln proclaimed Thanksgiving to be a national holiday. But let's look at the final fulfillment of the Feast of Tabernacles, God's Thanksgiving. It'll also be in the aftermath of another battle, the battle in the valley of Jehoshaphat, when the Lord will return in Zechariah chapters 13 and set up his Messianic kingdom. In chapter 14, it'll come about that any who are left of the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and celebrate the Feast of Booths. The Feast of Booths will be celebrated in Jerusalem in the millennial reign of Christ. And we've related this to the Transfiguration, why Peter wanted to build 3 booths, etc., on other of our recorded teachings. Much more to it than we're touching on today. But look what God told the Hebrews. You are to remember God's provision for you in the wilderness. How he took care of you when you were sojourning to the promised land. Our Thanksgiving should be the same. We're not celebrating what we have. We're looking forward to what we're going to get. We are remembering God's goodness and his provision to us, but our eyes are on the future. There will be a coming Thanksgiving feast in Jerusalem. Well, let's look. In the meantime, we're just thanking God for taking care of us in this world as sojourners. But notice, in Leviticus, it had to be your siblings, your family with you. In John 7, Jesus' siblings, his biological brothers. The text in John 7 draws a distinction between his disciples and his family. Again, this throws the Roman Catholic doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary out the window where it belongs. Nonetheless, let's look at this. What does this tell us? It tells us something about being reunited with our loved ones. In eternity, in heaven, if they're saved, yes. But when he comes back, our loved ones are with him. The first thing we're going to see is Jesus. The second thing we're going to see is our loved ones who died in the faith returning with him. Before eternity, we are going to live on this earth in a perfected Adamic state for 1,000 years. You might have had your parents, your family, your siblings for 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years. What's that? Sooner or later, death catches up. But it's a temporary death. It's a false death. It's a pseudo-death. Jesus has abolished death. We have Thanksgiving. Oh, you know, Uncle Amos died. Uncle Jacob died. Uncle Felix died. No. They're alive in Christ. I miss him. He was just here last Thanksgiving. Or I miss Mother. She was here last Thanksgiving. And now we're dining without her. Isn't it a sad occasion? No, it's a happy occasion. We're going to dine with her again. Certainly at the marriage supper of the Lamb. And certainly at the Feast of Tabernacles when Jesus comes back. It is a family celebration. Now we thank God for getting us through this fallen world, this barren wilderness. But a real Thanksgiving is coming. And it won't be Uncle Arthur who slices the turkey. The host will be the Lord Jesus. Happy Thanksgiving. Give thanks to the Lord for what he did, for what he's doing, and for what he's going to do. May the Lord bless all of you. and each of us and our families and keep us together until that day. God bless.